Welcome to the Faith Trends Podcast, conversations that connect research with ministry.
I'm Lindsay, Callaway, a researcher with the EFC's Center for Research on Church and Faith. This episode features our first returning guest, Bruce Clemenger. Bruce is Senior Ambassador and President Emeritus at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, having served as CEO and President of the EFC for 20 years. Bruce has supervised over 60 court interventions and has appeared before numerous parliamentary committees spanning across the tenures of 6 prime ministers. On today's episode, we discuss his new book, The New Orthodoxy, Canada's Emerging Civil Religion. Today's episode closes with Bruce answering Francis Schaeffer's question for us as Canadians. How then should we live?
Bruce, thank you for being our guest on the Faith Trends Podcast. Before we get started, I think it would be helpful if we defined a few terms for our listeners. And some of these terms have common meanings, but you're using them in a very specific way. And so could we start by defining secular with respect to the public square, and then could you also contrast it with sectarian?
Sure, happy to. Secular has a long history and varied meanings. Originally, as my understanding is that it meant non-church. So you go back to the time of the Middle Ages, and if you had an educational, developing a Christian university, that would be considered secular because it wasn't church. So secular meant non-church, and it morphed into meaning non-religion, or something that excludes religion. So a secular realm, a secular sphere is something that is not linked to or advances any notion of religion. The word sect, then, was again an old term used to identify specific religious ideologies, a set of religious beliefs, even denominations. So when you talked about something being sectarian, it means that it was rooted or founded or grounded in a specific religious set of beliefs. And non-sectarian then would mean that you're trying to accommodate or be fair amongst the various sects, the various religious sets of beliefs that are at play within a given society. So within the context of the book, when I'm talking about secular, I mean governments that seek to treat all religions or all sects within its jurisdiction fairly or equally. And the other element of secular is that you're not grounding a set of laws or policies in any one given religious vision of life, any one sect within that society. So, for example, Canada once had a thing called the Lord's Day Act. And under the Lord's Day Act, you could not have large stores opened on Sunday. And that was challenged when the charter came into effect. And basically, the Supreme Court said, well, Canada is now a secular country, and you can't base your laws in a specific religious tradition, in any one sect that may be at play within society. Now, it doesn't mean you couldn't have a common pause day, but the rationale for the legislation would have to be secular reasons rather than grounded in a specific religious doctrine or religious vision of life.
And so if you did ground your laws in a particular sect's doctrine, then that would be sectarian. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. That's so helpful, Bruce. The next thing before we start talking about the New Orthodoxy, and congratulations on your book, I found it just fascinating. You're talking about a new civil religion in Canada. And could you tell us why a secular state might want a civil religion, even if that's the term that the government might not use for it?
Let's go back to the definition. A civil religion is really the religious values of a nation that's expressed through public rituals, ceremonies, symbols, sacred days. And so by that definition, then, Canada, civil religion up, I would argue, until about 1960s was basically Christianity. Our public holidays were Easter, Christmas. Most of our public rituals had some type of priestly function was present to bless the event. It was only in the early 1960s that we got a new national flag, which didn't have a Christian symbol in it. So a dimension of religion, then, are the convictions, the presuppositions, the commitments that give fundamental direction to action. This is also what an ideology does. And so when those convictions are broadly shared, they can be used to legitimize the authority of civil institutions. They provide a fundamental value orientation that brings people together for common action. So when I'm talking about a new orthodoxy in my book, I'm talking about this collection of convictions, commitments, presuppositions. Now, I would argue that in Canada up until, again, early 1960s, the dominant civil religion was Christianity. And as Christianity began to wane, and as other religions emerged, and as governments tried to become a little more secular or non-sectarian in their approach, then Christianity began fading. And the question is, if Christianity fades from that role of public religion, what will fill the vacuum, what will fill the void? Now, for a secular government, there needs to be some set of beliefs or common commitments, common values, principles of justice, ideas of just procedures, and so on, that will bind the country together and will help shape how governments approach their task of implementing laws and passing laws. And so there's always in the background some, what I call a political creed. There's some set of values or principles that will operate and guide a government. Well, let me put it this way. When a state begins to promote or become a public defender of one set of convictions or commitments over others, so within a religiously plural society such as Canada is, there's a variety of different religions at play, there's a variety of different ideologies that people subscribe to. And when the government identifies one set of convictions or commitments from one of those groups, one of those sects within society, and it does so over others, it's no longer non-sectarian, treating all fairly, it begins favoring one, and by favoring one in the public square, in laws and public policy, in its decision-making processes, in a sense it presses the dissenting ones, the ones that would disagree perhaps with some of those principles of how they're defined, will press them kind of into the private sphere. So I think that's the operationalization of what may happen when a government that originally was non-sectarian becomes more and more sectarian, becomes a privileged one of the sects over the others.
Bruce, before we get into the meat of our conversation, I'm wondering if you could define the term liberalism. So we talk about liberalism very generally in many different ways in the public square. How are you using it?
Liberalism at a core is the promotion of individual freedom. So we live in a liberal democracy. With the risk of oversimplification, democracy means that each citizen has an equal vote, and citizens will direct and restrain government action. In other words, the majority rules. The liberal part of liberal democracy means that we also seek to protect individual freedom against the overreach of the government or the will of majority. So, for example, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the purpose of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is actually to lay out what the rights and freedoms of Canadian citizens, of individuals, and really to protect them from overreach of the government, even if the majority wills that infringement. So recently in Canada, there's been a lot of conversation about the notwithstanding clause. The reason it's controversial is that a notwithstanding clause, when it's invoked, allows the government to pursue a series of laws and policies that actually begin infringing on the rights and freedoms guaranteed in the Charter, but in a sense they exempt themselves from that application. So you have two things. You have democracy, which at its core means the majority will rule, and you have this liberal passion for promoting and defending individual freedom. And so it's that kind of balancing act. So that's how I understand liberalism. And again, the focus is individual freedom. It's not as much a focus on group rights or group freedoms. The focus is on individual and their freedom. And usually the mantra goes that you are free to do whatever you want to do, insofar as your freedom does not hinder the like freedom of someone else. Usually that's understood to be the harm principle. So you can exercise your freedom as long as in the exercise of your freedom you're not harming someone else. So that's at the core of what it means, liberalism, liberty. That's the focus.
So in your book, it's really a story about how Canada's civil religion went from a non-sectarian Christianity to a new civil religion. And we'll spend some time soon talking about the shape of that new civil religion. But I was wondering if you can first tell us about how Canada came to have a non-sectarian Christian civil religion.
At its founding, 1867, there were really two dominant expressions of the Christian religion. Catholicism, primarily in Quebec, and Anglicanism and Protestantism in other provinces. So being non-sectarian in that context meant treating both fairly. So prime ministers and politicians generally would not be too explicit about which Christian tradition they belong to. I think this is why Canadian politicians probably rarely wear their religion on their sleeve, unlike in the US, because if you're too Catholic or too Anglican or too Protestant in your expression, you would alienate, half the country. And so in 1867, they went so far as to guarantee minority religious education in Ontario, Quebec. So in Quebec, they protected minority Protestant education. And in Ontario, they protected minority Catholic education. Because at that time, they couldn't envision a public system that would be unbiased. And so what they sought to do is try to be fair within the Catholic and the Protestant, expressions within Canada. So in a sense, it was non-sectarian between, the dominant Christian sects, as it were, dominant Christian expressions. It doesn't mean it was all-inclusive, all different religions and sets of beliefs that were at play in Canada. It kind of regulated the majority ones, but not necessarily the minority ones. And as other religions grew, this non-sectarianism was expanded to include other religions. So it kind of, in a sense, shifted from a Christian pluralism to a religious pluralism. Now, that wasn't an easy transition. So there are many legal battles fought by minority religious communities that fought to be included in this kind of non-sectarian club, if you will. And we're still learning of the harm done to Indigenous peoples by the residential school system, when being non-sectarian, again, was being narrowly defined. So I think over time what happened is as religions grew in popularity among citizens, Canada's non-sectarian stance moved from beyond Christianity to embrace other religions that were at play in Canada. But again, being non-sectarian, what the government tried to do was to be fair towards all these different expressions within the society. And again, try not to base or ground its laws or policy or justify them on the basis of any one specific tradition. And this is really the history of liberalism itself, is that liberalism was, in a sense, birthed out of the religious wars in Europe. And the idea was, can we find a way to ground the idea of the state government, its authority, its legitimacy, in something other than a set of, back then, Christian doctrines, be they Catholic, Anglican, or another form of Protestantism. So they tried to find a separate basis to ground their ideas. Back then you had that notion of divine right of kings, and so whether the king was Catholic or Anglican or the governing authority was some form of Protestant expression. The question is, can you separate the idea of what it means to govern from that religious basis? So that's where liberalism tried to find an alternative basis to understand how we can undertake government. And that's where the idea of becoming non-sectarian came in, that we'll try to be as fair as possible to the different religious expressions at play within society.
And Bruce, foundational to finding that basis, that non-religious basis, was this idea of a state of nature. And you pick this up, you talk about Rawls's veil of ignorance, you talk about Locke and Hobbes and Rousseau. How is this idea of the state of nature used to form a new foundation in order to build sort of a liberal superstructure on top of it?
So if you try to bracket religion, bracket various biblical texts you would use to justify the divine right of kings, or were used to argue for more of a parliamentary system, say within England, the question was, what gives rise to the need for a government? So they started to use language of social contract. So government, let's think of government as being the result of a social contract where people in a certain jurisdiction gather together and say, okay, it's time for us to have a government. We want someone to protect us. We want someone to adjudicate our disputes. We want someone to build roads, right? Build the infrastructure. So what should that government look like, and how do we guide and direct, that government? And so they started thinking about, well, what's humanity like in a state of nature? And so someone like John Locke saw basically people were basically good, reasonable, peaceful creatures. And so he thought you didn't need a really strong, heavily structured government. Whereas Hobbes, for example, thought that life was nasty, brutal, and short, and people were basically at war with one another outside some type of civilized structure. And so therefore you wanted a more robust, stronger government that would, in a sense, keep those passions at bay and create a structure within which people could actually be civil and live together in some measure of peace and quiet. Rousseau thought that basically people were nice and pleasant in nature, but it's community, society that often causes the tensions and the bad behavior. And so he was actually one who kind of emphasized the need for a civil religion. What you needed is some common ethic, some common binding agent that would keep people in order. And then the government is kind of an expression of how we maintain that order. So, but each of those views of the state of nature, whether is humanity basically good and reasonable, or are we basically evil, naughty, and selfish, will determine what kind of government we think we'll need. But again, that means that whatever government you have is kind of rooted on a certain understanding of human anthropology, about human nature, ideas of human flourishing, and what it means to live together and collaborate one with another to build a good society. So even in a notion of the form of government you have tells you something about what the origins of that government was perceived to address in terms of the nature of humanity.
Now, a big part of how liberalism is structured in Canada is rooted in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And you write that actually accelerated the emergence of a new orthodoxy. Can you tell us how this happened and why the Charter and jurisprudence took us in this direction?
Yeah, the Charter actually could be read either as kind of a non-sectarian missive, or it could be used again to promote kind of more of a sectarian approach to politics. The Charter doesn't self-interpret. So it talks about, freedom of religion, conscience, thought, opinion, belief, freedom of association, those kind of things. In Section 7, it talks about principles of fundamental justice. It talks about life, liberty, security of the person. Section 15 talks about equality, but the Charter itself does not interpret what those terms mean. So you need some type of broader framework or broader understanding or set of values, set of norms, set of principles that will enable you to interpret what those terms mean and how to apply them. And the question is, where does that background set of norms and principles, where do they derive from? So one way of understanding it would be that there are these different sects, these different religious worldviews, ideologies at play within Canadian society adhered to by a variety of different citizens. And so those norms, principles are really the result of a convergence. So no matter all the major faith traditions in the world affirm something like human dignity, and also would promote the basic notions of freedom and equality. And so there's kind of a convergence on a set of principles, and those principles then provide the background for a document like the Charter. Another way of understanding it is that the Charter then kind of codifies those set of principles, those agreed upon norms and values, but then it can take on a life of its own. And the question is, when the Charter is being interpreted, is it interpreted in light of those norms and those principles that find agreement amongst the variety of sects, the variety of religions within society, or are they becoming to kind of define them differently, distinctively, or are they drawing on one of the many different traditions, one of the many sects to interpret and understand what those principles mean? And that's where the Charter then can become a mechanism for advancing a more sectarian understanding, where it draws for its interpretation of those key terms in the Charter, draws on one of the various religious traditions or ideological traditions at play within society. And that becomes the danger. So, for example, in 1993, the Supreme Court weighed in on the issue of assisted suicide. And it basically decided that Canada was a country that affirmed the sanctity of human life. That term doesn't appear within the Charter. It's kind of echoed in Section 7, life, liberty, security of the person. But they thought that meant that we should not allow assisted suicide in Canada. You fast forward to 2015, and Supreme Court still wants to respect religious freedom, but under the guise of protecting the autonomy of individuals, I think exceptions should be created, and in some cases, assisted suicide should be provided for individuals. Now, that word autonomy doesn't appear in the Charter. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the Constitution of Canada, but it's used as a kind of a new norm or principle by the courts and by legislatures to justify how they interpret the Charter, move it forward. So that's where we begin importing ideas or principles or norms from a certain tradition that might be played within Canada, and it becomes the determinative set of framework through which the Charter is applied.
We talk a bit about autonomy and why it might be in conflict with Christianity, because after all, don't we want autonomy too?
Yes. So autonomy, I think, historically meant the ability to make independent decisions. So you weren't being coerced. Your arm wasn't being twisted. You were able to resist pressure to go one way and go the way you want to go. So it's kind of akin to freedom of conscience. You're free to believe what you want to believe. However, the meaning has changed over time, and this was anticipated generations ago, but the meaning has changed and shifted kind of beyond freedom of thought to now mean self-determination. And this is self-determination in a fairly radical sense. So it includes the capacity in a way to separate oneself from everything that shapes you, your tradition, your religion, your conscience, even biology, and to self-determine who you want to become, to self-define. It's a much more radical understanding of autonomy than was used 20, 30, 40 years ago. I was at a conference just before COVID struck, and the Justice Minister of Canada talked about the role of government being allowing people to flourish in a way that they want to live, choose to live, in order to make autonomy a real and robust concept. Well, if he's meaning autonomy as self-determination, and if it's the government's role to kind of promote that self-determination, then the government will be a partner with you in trying to ensure that you're not somehow unduly influenced by tradition, religion, family origin, conscience. So actually, in a sense, you need to, if you're truly going to be autonomous, you need to somehow be freed from the shackles of your conscience to explore other opportunities and other choices. So that's where the term has become much more, in a sense, radical.
Bruce, in your book, you reference George Grant, and you write that autonomy directing justice, the pursuit of equality of primary goods will, quote, exclude liberal justice from those who are too weak to enforce contracts, the imprisoned, the mentally unstable, the unborn, the aged, the defeated, and sometimes even the morally unconforming. And I think you're talking about this idea of a social contract, and that there are some people that just don't have the power to see the social contract enforced in their favor. That's a really interesting idea. Can you sort of expand a little bit on how you see that playing out in Canadian society over the last few decades?
A classic example right now is the concern over the continued expansion of hastened death offered as part of our healthcare system. Because we're increasingly finding there are people who have severe disabilities who are facing tough choices. They're being offered hastened death or assisted suicide, but there's not a sufficient support structure or system to support them in their life. So they're having to choose between poverty or being provided death. So I think that's probably, this is before Grant, this is after Grant's time, but probably something he was looking at. There's something he felt within liberalism, particularly as it's shaped by this pursuit of autonomy, by self-definition, which in a sense means that those who are able to advocate will be able to advocate within a system to protect their interests, whereas those who are unable to advocate, who are vulnerable, marginalized, will somehow be left left on the side of the road. And I think that was his concern. How well does the government listen to the voices of all citizens? Or is it becoming more ideological? Is it becoming more sectarian and listen to a certain range of voices and try to satisfy their desires and their aspirations rather than looking after those who don't have the same strength of voice? And so I think that's why it's incumbent on us to try to empower the voices of those who otherwise aren't being heard. Because again, it's too easy for them to be left to the side of the road, marginalized and not heard.
It just struck me, Bruce, that in this whole conversation, there's an assumed set of people that are actors, right? There's the government, and then there's the individual, which is sort of the structure that the charter sets up.
Yeah, and what's missing?
Yeah, and what's missing? And, well, there's groups like the church, and this is sort of where I'm going with this, but it's almost assumed that there really isn't a place in that conversation or in that negotiation of the social contract for any other actors. And there's almost a sense that there's an illegitimacy to the other actors sort of stepping in on behalf of those people that aren't strong enough to sort of defend their piece of the social contract.
I mean, it's referred to as often as civil society. So it's churches, it's other types of institutions, it's clubs, it's associations that knit people together. And it's often in that zone of civil society, a family, church, associations, that people find belonging and find community and develop friendships. That's how we get to know our neighbor, through the different hats we wear and through the different engagements, associations we participate in within a local community, within our society. To a degree, those are kind of overlooked. Again, the charter itself doesn't really talk too much about communities. It talks more about multiculturalism, but the emphasis is really on the individual. And part of this is good news. I mean, as the governments have expanded, it means that they have started funding healthcare and they have education. I mean, there wasn't too long ago, back Canada's founding, that education was a private matter. And it took a while for governments to begin assuming responsibility for the education system. And same thing with healthcare. Just look at some of the names of the old hospitals in Canada, and there's some religious entity behind the formation of those hospitals. And so the government has kind of slowly either taken them over or become the majority funder of those institutions. So the government's kind of extended itself into all areas and walks of life. And so increasingly it seems to be, that there's this kind of bifurcation of life. There's either individual or state, and that the middling institutions seem to be disappearing. And that's of concern. But also it means that if you're an individual and there's not a strong sense of family, a strong sense of community, a strong sense of church, strong sense of association, where do you find your belonging? And if we begin putting pressure on the state to be our primary place of belonging, that citizenship is somehow our primary relationship to one another, then I think that distorts what the role of government should be. I don't think it should be the role of government to foster fraternity, community across the nation. There's a limited role it has. I think the deep sense of belonging we desire needs to be found locally. It can lead to all sorts of harm when the government takes on the role to be the primary place of belonging for all Canadians.
Bruce, I'm curious to know what you think the role of sectarian, that is religious intervention in this governing process that is meant to be non-sectarian. What do you think is the role? And what has been EFC's approach and why when we think about making our voices heard in a non-sectarian process?
It's governments that need to be non-sectarian, not the rest of us. So I would argue we're all sectarian. So I'd go back to Romans 1. You're either worshiping God or a creature. And so we all worship something. Bob Dylan, you got to serve somebody. It may be the devil, it may be the Lord, you got to serve somebody. And that's true. It's biblically true, and I think it's true in reality. So we all have some type of a worldview or comprehensive doctrine, as one referred to it, or a set of beliefs and convictions, commitments that guide us and shape our lives. And so if the government is to be non-sectarian, then when it's considering laws, public policy, when the courts are reviewing laws, they need to hear from those various sects, those various expressions of human flourishing that exist in society. They need to hear from them so they make wise decisions. And those decisions are reflected on kind of that convergence of principles and values of Canadians rather than being more sectarian. So in a non-sectarian environment, it's really important that the various people within society that have different beliefs, different sets of convictions, are heard by their politicians, so the politicians can listen and hear and see if they can find some consensus amongst the diversity and move forward in a way that benefits all people. That's for the public good. When a government becomes more sectarian, then in a sense it becomes the task of citizens, especially those who are dissenters or the nonconformists from whatever ideology the government is pushing forward, to remind the government that it's actually taking sides in the debate. And it needs to be very careful because now it's no longer becoming a government for all the people, but it's becoming a government of some of the people. So that's where, again, so as EFC, what we do is we make submissions to parliamentary committees on various laws that are being considered, and we bring very upfront about it. We identify what we see principles drawn from Scripture and encourage the government to apply them to their deliberations on the laws, on the policies they're considering. And that's not just for us, but we think that if they follow these principles, value human dignity, those kind of things, that it'll be a benefit to all Canadians, not just for us. In the courts, when the law is being challenged, again, we seek to bring those principles to bear. We do it in very legal language, and we argue using precedents from previous court cases or academic articles and so on. But again, we're trying to assist the court in fully understanding the issue before them. And in a sense, that's what intervener status means in the Latin. It's often talked about friends of the court. You only get to intervene if the court thinks you have something to contribute to the conversation. So in a non-sectarian society, it's important that the diversity of what's at play within society is being heard so that the government can be truly non-sectarian and try to be fair in how it proceeds. But it also means that the set of principles the government uses to justify what it's doing are fairly narrow and limited. They're only those upon which there's kind of this convergence. I call that the political creed. Every institution, every organization has some type of mission and vision statement. All have this kind of faith and religious dimension, including the state. And so there will be a creed, a set of principles or values or commitments that identify what's at the core of the government and how it would guide the government and how it's going to decide on laws and public policies and so on. The question is, how expansive does that creed become? And I think the more expansive it becomes, the more likely it's become increasingly ideological or sectarian. And if the government begins pushing those certain set of values or commitments that are not shared by all Canadians, that's where you start pressing dissenters, opposing views into the private square, if you will. And those principles and norms and spill over out of just the political realm of citizenship and law, but can begin to spill over and be kind of pressed into civil society, which again, I think is inherently sectarian. And that's where you get this conflict. So that's why I describe as the new orthodoxy in my book, is that there's these set of principles and norms or values that are being detached from a sense of convergence amongst what all Canadians can agree upon. And they're becoming a little more sectarian, a little more ideological. They're spilling over outside the political into other areas of life. So now there's a set of public values, a set of public commitments that you're expected to adhere to as a citizen in public square. You can believe whatever you want privately, but in publicly you have to express kind of affirmation to a certain set of values. And that's where the idea of autonomy, it starts to penetrate outside of just the political sphere and into other areas of life.
So, Bruce, the proposition, the main thesis of your book is that there is this new emerging orthodoxy, this new civil religion in Canada. I think you trace it out that new orthodoxy is not Christianity. So how then should we as Christians live in Canada when the new civil religion is sometimes at odds with what we believe? How should we live? We've described a little bit about how an organization like the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada engages in that sphere. How then should we live?
Yeah, the premise is that we had a civil religion, in effect, it wasn't established, but we had a civil religion in the name of Christianity. It has declined in influence for a variety of reasons. And in my mind, that creates a vacuum. It's not that when Christianity prevailed, that justice always prevailed. And again, I referred earlier to things like the tragedy of the residential schools. But there was kind of this civil religion at play in the background, which provided that shaping influence of a lot of law and public policies, whether for good or for ill. And as that fades, it creates a vacuum. And the question is, what's going to fill that vacuum? And so, in my mind, it means either we're going to be able to live in an open, plural society where we come together with our neighbors in civility and respect and debate and decide upon what's in the public interest and inform our politicians to the direction we think they ought to go. Or a new hegemony will emerge, which means there will be dissenters and nonconformists. So in that vortex, in my book, I'm trying to make a case for the open pluralism model. I think there's still a possibility of sustaining that or maintaining it, but there's battling against, again, other types of influences and forces that are I think, pushing Canada in a more sectarian direction. So I prefer non-sectarian over sectarian at one level. The other one is that part of religious freedom is often understood as being a defensive battle to make sure we have a sphere within which we can exercise our faith, we can live out our faith in relative peace. Another aspect of religious freedom is knowing what you believe. Because you can only really have religious freedom if you have the ability to change your religion. You can only change your religion after you know what you believe. And the question is, do Canadians really know what they believe? If my argument about autonomy is correct, this notion of human flourishing rooted in this kind of self-authenticity, self-determination, if that's true, do Canadians realize, is that really what they believe? Or is what they believe a hodgepodge of things? And so I think part of our task is to read the signs of the times, to understand the different ebbs and flows, the different currents within our society, to try to discern what are those commitments, what are those values, what are the norms that people guide their lives by, and have conversations about it. So help people understand what it is that they believe, what forms their basic commitments, what are their ideas of human flourishing, what do they think the purpose of life is, and have a conversation at that level. Because then, in a sense, we free them up to either affirm, yes, this is what I actually do believe and want to pursue it, or to pause and say, are there other alternatives? And of course, that to me, that's the robust, interesting dialogue that needs to take place. Because then it'd be easier to argue that certain laws and policies in the political sphere or certain decisions made in other spheres of life, they're not free and open and have no consequence, but they're actually rooted in some underlying commitment or aspiration. I think that's the conversation we need to have, because only when we have that conversation at the interpersonal level, in the level of civil society, engaging with one another to understand one another, I think then we can better understand what are the ebbs and flows of currents that are at play, that are shaping governments, that are shaping our laws and our institutions. So that's what I'll be calling Canadians to. So in the book, I'm contrasting the sectarian to non-sectarian and warning about this emerging sectarian orthodoxy that's kind of in ascendancy. And again, if it continues to grow and nurture, and then it becomes the basis for something like a civil religion. Or do we opt for this open pluralism? But either way, I think our task is to help our neighbors understand what it is that they believe and engage with them on that level and have a robust conversation about what are the norms, what are the principles, what are the values that we believe in, how do they apply to our life, how can they shape our common lives together. And that's the foundation of kind of our witness to others, that this is what we believe, this is who we follow, and this is why we think this is what our understanding of human flourishing is as Christians, and invite others to consider that. But I think they can all really consider it if they actually understand what it is that they believe themselves. So that's part of our task, is to help them enjoy religious freedom by helping to disclose to them what is actually they believe, and whether life based on those sets of beliefs will actually provide the outcomes, the contentment, the shalom that they're desiring.
Bruce Clemenger's new book is called The New Orthodoxy, Canada's Emerging Civil Religion. We will put a link to where you can find that book in the show notes. Bruce, thank you so much for being on Faith Trends podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. Find out more about the EFC's research at www.theefc.ca/research.